The Week in Bible Prophecy, a Prophecy Watchers podcast.
Welcome to the program today. Mauro Gonzalez here in studio. We have our good friend from England, Keelan, with us. And Graham was here just a few weeks ago, and we were doing some messages on the state of Israel. We talked about the Israel dilemma, and we also talked about just the nature of apartheid and how Graham had grown up in South Africa, and so he's got firsthand experience about that. But the key thing for all this, as it relates to the nation of Israel, is that there's so much confusion. And so this is why I love hanging out with Graham and chatting with him about really the history, because what we're going to see today is most people, most politicians and states and the United Nations, etc., they always talk about the two-state solution. And we want to give a history of that, of where it came from, why it's still being spoken of, but also just really the problems that are the ramifications from the problems of what that might look like. And so here we are. Graham, welcome.
Thank you, Mondo. Good to join you again. It's
always good. And this is important too, because you have behind you three flags, which I'd love for you to share about that, because that really does lead to the foundation of going all the way back to the middle of last century, in the beginnings, even before the state of Israel, and the importance of those three flags and those three countries.
Indeed. So we're continuing, because when I was in studio with you last time, so we're continuing our Anglo-American Summit, Prophecy Summit, concerning the nation of Israel. So people might be aware, might not be aware, but my nation in particular, the story is pretty much our story for about really from the time of Cromwell. So, 1640s, when he first released Lets the Jews Back In. And then the idea of the Restoration movement through the evangelical movement. And then that gives birth to the modern, to an evangelical Zionist movement before there's even a Jewish Zionist movement. So, that is going on from the Puritans, particularly John Owen. We did another series on this, Mondo, where we looked at that. So the Puritans, the evangelicals, the age of, the Restorationist movement. So the late second half of the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and then going all the way really up until, we get those pivotal dates, the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So up until that time, it's predominantly a British story. And then what we will have is the Americans then come into play. And we're going to sort of like explore now that sort of era, especially the Second World War, because this is where the two-state solution begins to get a bit of traction amongst the great powers, because obviously, the British have had the mandate since 1922 officially, but they've been controlling Palestine since 1917 effectively. They'd had allowed Jewish immigration. Winston Churchill was a great player in this, so we could, even in the 20s, and we're going to see he continues to be a great player in this story, all the way up until the creation of the State of Israel, all the way to 1950, 1951. So we're going to look at some of his writings, because number one, he's prime minister at the time of the Second World War, and then he's ousted from office, but he's the leader of the opposition from 1945 to 1951. So again, he's very much a pro-Zionist. He's very pro-Jewish. He always has been all of his life. So if we look at some of Churchill's letters and some of the discourses that he had with key figures, and then some of his presentations in the House of Commons here, both as Prime Minister and but mainly as leader of the opposition after the war. And of course, this is when his great friendship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the war, even before the war in the 30s, they do have a great friendship, and that begins to sort of create a bit of an Anglo-American alliance, as it were, which really hadn't existed before this time, not to such an extent. So so that's what we're going to look at, I think, this time, and I hope people find it interesting, and just stay with us, because Mondo, what we get sometimes, people just, I'm a stickler for detail and for understanding the story. And what we do have a lot of times is people just, throwing statements out. I'm for a two-state solution. I'm against a two-state solution. But we have to realize that for the Allied powers, the Western powers particularly, and the Western nations are Israel's sponsor without question. The Soviets were, the Soviet Stalin was actually the first to recognize the Jewish state. But for the most part, the West is Israel's sponsors and remains so to this day. So what we want to explore is why this insistence on the two-state solution, where it was born, why it was born, and in what intention was it born? Were there good intentions, bad intentions, or mixed intentions? So that's where we're going to go.
Yeah, and then ultimately we will end up discussing kind of the reality on the ground today in modern times of whether a two-state solution, what it looks like, I think, for each party, and what it looks like for the United Nations, who was very much involved in the original idea of it. But then also, is it even feasible? Is this, are we destined for this antagonism and for a lack of a true solution all the way until what? The Lord returns. So that's what we kind of want to do, is kind of lay the groundwork for some of this, but also to discuss, again, not only history, but the future and the current reality, which, what we've been seeing lately, and again, is just more of this contention that has come to be. And it's, to me, Graham, it comes down to just Zechariah 12, that at the time of the end, that God would make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all nations, a cup of trembling, that all the nations would be gathered in some ways or being entangled with it. And so when we look at all the going from really the 30s on of last century, it's been almost 100 years. And so we're seeing now that the contention is still there, and it's still not going to go away, because ultimately we know that God has a plan for Israel. They are not going to be kicked out of the land no matter what anybody says, because God has a purpose for them. That doesn't mean God agrees with everything they're doing, but His purpose is to save them, the national leadership, which that's their destiny, is to be saved by the end of what we understand as the 70th week of Daniel. So all the machinations that are happening now are just part of the process of that ultimate salvation of Israel according to Romans 11:26. So as Graham said, hang around because I think it's very interesting, and it will also give us, I think, a reality check of where it's been and where it's going. So kind of lead us off here, Graham.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mondo. So, let's start in 1945. So everybody will know that is the end of the Second World War. It's drawing to a close. And we see that the Allies have fought against the Nazis. They've liberated the Jews from the camps, those who survived from the camps. Of course, this then is a great impetus in terms of creating a state for the Jews. Because even during the Mandate period, the 20s, the 30s, it really wasn't that you had your hardcore Zionists, but really most of world Jewry was not interested in a Zionist state. They thought, why on earth do we want to go to the desert, and to fulfill some biblical prophecies? Like they were well established in America. They had a big Jewish community in America, obviously, and in Europe too. Europe had the biggest Jewish community up until the Holocaust, greater than the United States. So 1945, begins. There are like 3 independent Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq. And they're kind of putting pressure on Britain and the United States concerning, what is the future of the Jews in Palestine? What do you have in mind? Because during the Mandate period, this can is being kicked down the road time and time again, or at least the British are trying to maintain some sort of order to have the Arabs and the Jews living together. They didn't succeed in the end, but it wasn't all bad during the Mandate period. I think that's important to realize. It was pretty Israel was brought, Palestine was brought into the modern world. New buildings, new technology, railways, everything. So Jerusalem, it literally was the new Jerusalem was being built during British Mandate period. So, great things happening there, but obviously the unrest within the different communities on who's actually going to control this. But Churchill in 1945, after this, huge what's the word I'm looking for? This huge effort to claim victory over the Nazis, over Germany. He hasn't given way on his idea of a Zionist state. He's always thinking of a Zionist state, and because he knows that there's about 500,000 Jews living in West Palestine. When we talk about West Palestine, we're talking now west of the Jordan, right? So what we would consider now to be in the modern state of Israel. So that's called West Palestine. And it was just under a third of the Arab population. So he knew that the Jews would be under the mercy of a hostile Arab state, right? And a hostile Arab majority. So he's wanting the Jews to be able to govern themselves. And he has a meeting with Roosevelt on the warship Quincy in February 1945. Now, don't forget, the Allies now are advancing. They've done the D-Day thing in 44. They're advancing. The war they know is going to be won. It's going to draw to a close. So they're planning now on this post-world order. And we have to remember, we talk about these couple of flags here. So my nation and your nation. We actually set the cornerstones for the world, the international order that we now live in. So after 45, it was the Bretton Woods here in England that set up the financial order. I know people don't like the United Nations, but it wasn't then as it was now. We actually created the United Nations. The first meeting of the United Nations was actually in London, St. James's Palace, and it was the nations who were united against Nazi Germany. Of course, America at the time wasn't in the war, so this is about 1941. So it wasn't part of that initial grouping. And then when America enters into the war, this great friendship, and of course America brings all of its economic might and manpower and weaponry into the war, and so it's the Anglo-American partnership which kind of begins to set in motion the framework of the new world order, effectively. So the United Nations, NATO, of course, we are the founding members of NATO. All the global trade and tariff agreements, that's an Anglo-American thing. So again, we have to realize that the Allies winning the war, and we're talking principally now, the Anglo-American alliance is beginning to create this new international order, which we have enjoyed living under for the last 80 years or so, 75 years, whatever, 80 years. And of course, but the Palestine question is first and foremost too, right? So they have a meeting, Mondo, and but before that, Churchill had said to King Ibn Saud, he's called Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, to have a meeting with Roosevelt also on the warship before Churchill, and apparently Roosevelt and Ibn Saud spent many hours together, and they had a discussion, but it didn't go very well in terms for Churchill's dream of a Jewish state. So here is what the King Ibn Saud, so this is 14th of February, he says to President Roosevelt on the warship, he says, Arabs and Jews can never cooperate, neither in Palestine nor in any other country. What changed the whole picture was the immigration from Eastern Europe of people who were technically and culturally on a higher level than the Arabs, who had greater difficulty in surviving economically. That these energetic Europeans are Jewish is not the cause of the trouble. It is their superior skills and culture. So this is the Saudi Arabian king saying this, right? He realized that a superior culture, superior people were coming into Palestine. It was going to upset the balance of power. And then 3 days later, Ibn Saud writes to Winston Churchill. He says the Jews in Palestine are continuously increasing in number. They are even forming a sort of government of their own, with a prime minister, a foreign minister, and a minister of defense. They also had formed a military force of 30,000 men with modern arms and equipment. They have thus become a great danger to the Arabs. The Arabs would fight the Jews, and even if they were not victorious, they would not mind because they would go to paradise. I continually advise moderation to the Arabs with regard to Palestine, but fear that a clash might come. So, you know, the King Ibn Saud, he is an ally in terms of trying to solve the Palestine issue, the Palestine problem. So, and this is what Churchill says now on the 27th of February that year, 45. He's in his speech to the House of Commons. He says that King Saud's aid will be needed. I have hopes that when the war is over, World War II, good arrangements can be made for securing the peace and progress of the Arab world and generally of the Middle East, and that Great Britain and the United States, which is taking an increasing interest in these regions, will be able to play a valuable part. So here we have got Churchill's optimism that he's seeing, you know, this relationship here between this Anglo-American relationship being able to sort of deal with the major issues in this new international order. The Arabs, of course, are completely suspicious about all this, as you can imagine. Emir Abdullah. Now, Abdullah is he's the king of Jordan, Transjordania. Okay, and he says this to Churchill. He says now Churchill had put Abdullah in Transjordania back in 1921. All right. He says the inhabitants of the Arab world are in ferment over the future of Palestine. The Arabs believe at present that the Jews want to have Palestine only as a means of their future domination of the whole Arab world economically as well as politically. Again, Saud to Churchill. This is in March that year. The ambitions of the Jews are not confined to Palestine alone. The preparations they have made show that they intend to take hostile action against neighboring Arab countries to create a form of Nazi fascism within sight of the democracies and in the midst of the Arab countries. Now get this is what he says. Now talk about history revisionism here, right? Here's what the king says to Churchill. Joshua captured the land of the Canaanites, an Arab tribe, with great cruelty and barbarity. The Arabs have been in Palestine since 3,500 years before Christ. They have ruled it alone or with the Turks for 1,300 years. The disjointed rule of the Jews did not exceed 380 confused and sporadic years, ending in 332 BC. For 2,200 years, there have been few Jews there. I mean, that's a lie completely. And they have had no influence. They were aliens who had come to Palestine at intervals and had then been turned out over 2,000 years ago. So we see here the Churchill's optimism is being met, obviously, with a lot of resistance here now on the ground. And it's both Jewish and Arab resistance. And then not only that, you also have Chaim Weizmann. So Weizmann, if everybody, or maybe they don't know, but he's a British Jew. He's got a very friendly relationship with Churchill, always had since 1907 when Churchill got in British citizenship. And he becomes the leader of he's the guy who helps the British war effort, probably saves the British war effort in World War I by creating acetone for the shells, because the Brits were running out of ammunition to shell the Germans. So he creates that. He's a chemist. He becomes the first. He's very much the prominent Zionist voice, along with David Ben-Gurion, and he's like the first. I think he becomes the first president. Not the first, or he becomes president. It's either the Zionist Congress or the Jewish Agency. I forget which one. But anyway, he's high up. He will eventually become the first president of the new state of Israel in 1948. But he writes to Churchill in 45, because Britain had actually introduced this white paper in 39, restricting Jewish immigration, because it was a sop to the Arabs, and Churchill wasn't prime minister then, but it was a sop to the Arabs, and also to keep them on board, and because they needed the Arabs for the war effort against Germany. But here's what Weizmann says to Churchill. He says the Jewish people have waited till the end of the German war, not only for their deliverance from Hitler, but also from the injustice of the White Paper of 1939, which has so intensely aggravated both their sufferings and the loss of human life. We remember with gratitude how in the debate of 23rd of May 39, the voice of British conscience spoke through you, talking to Churchill. We have noted how during the years of war you have never let yourself be drawn into saying anything which could be interpreted as an acceptance of the White Paper. This has enabled me to urge upon my people patience, but now the German war is over, because the German war ends on May the 8th, 1945. Under your leadership, victory has come. Your word could never carry greater weight than it does now. That is so ironic, because in 2 months, Churchill will be out of office. The White Paper still stands, Weizmann remonstrates. It is prolonging the agony of the Jewish survivors. Will you not say the word which is to right wrongs and set the people free? Bit of a call there for Moses, right? So Churchill acknowledges the letter, but he tells Weizmann, he says, until the great powers come to the peace conference, he can't really do anything. Weizmann's completely disappointed by this. Your message came as a great shock to me. I'd always understood from our conversations that I probably would be considered as soon as the German war was over, but your phrase until the victorious allies are definitely seated at the peace table substitutes some indefinite date in the future. I can hardly believe this to have been your intention. And of course, obviously, the White Paper is being continued to be implemented to an extent. And Churchill just replies again back on the 29th of June. Churchill is out 3 weeks later than this. I'm afraid I cannot add nothing more to my letter of June the 9th, except to explain that the peace table means the peace table. And he's telling Weizmann that it's going to be, it's got to be by the year out. Of course, we know the Pacific War ends on August the 9th, doesn't it? I think it's August the 9th or somewhere thereabouts. But here's what Churchill says to Weizmann. This will interest you. It has occurred to me for some time that it might be a solution of your difficulties if the mandate were transferred from Britain to the United States, who with her great wealth and strength and strong Jewish elements might be able to do more for the Zionist cause than Great Britain. I need scarcely say I shall continue to do my best for it, but as you will know, it has very few supporters in the Conservative Party, and even the Labour Party now seem to have lost all zeal. So this is where now you can begin to see a transition. Because remember, Mondo, if we remember our discussions from previous things that we've done, the great evangelical move to bring the Jews back to Zion, back to Israel, which was a great British effort in the 19th century, and then also in the early part of the 20th century. With Balfour, Churchill, Lloyd George, etc. Well, this is now dying a death. At this particular juncture in history. So something else or somebody else is going to have to step in by divine providence, it seems, to take this Zionist story forward. And Churchill is saying, even in my own party, there are very few supporters, for this cause now. And the Labour Party have lost all zeal for it too, because the Labour Party of 45 are campaigning for, we're Zionists, we want to create the Zionist state, and the Jews were all for that. They were thinking, and so when Clement Attlee won the election in July 45, there was dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv, but of course sadly the socialists turned coats basically. And that was the end of, and they completely abandoned all pretense of a Zionist state. Go on, I spoke for long enough. You jump in there.
Well, it's just only a little bit to add. I go back to what Abdullah was saying, that the revisionism that you had as it relates to the land of Israel, or going all the way back, that they were the original Arab people that Joshua came over and made the conquest. Well, it's interesting that, as you said, that is just so untrue, because anybody that reads, Genesis 10 or 11 and looks at the genealogies there, Genesis 9, 10, and 11 of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, we know that Canaan was the son of Ham. And so Canaan was part of the the Ham dynasty of nations going into Africa as well. But if you look at the Arabs, they're a different group, and so for him to say that the Arabs were the Canaanites, that's ultimately what he's saying, and that Joshua came in and he bloodied them up and a variety of things. I mean, even if you don't believe in the sense of God, but you're just reading the biblical text as, let's say, it's history, what he's saying there is, again, total revisionism. That now, Graham, we know that that's often said today, that the original Israel will make an argument that they've been there for 3,000 years or even longer, going back certainly to Joshua's conquest to 1400 BC. But others will say, but no, we were there first. And you're like, you guys are Arabs. Okay, you're coming from a totally different area. You got the wrong family line. And so that's really important. If somebody's simply going to argue from a secular who was there first mentality, I guess you could go back to the Canaanites, which they're gone. They're nowhere around. There is no modern understanding of who the Canaanites were of the sons of Ham. The children of Ham. You'd have to go to Africa for that. So we don't see that. So that's just important. What you have here for all of us is we think about getting the facts as it relates to understanding a two-state solution. There's a lot going here. There's a lot of lies going back and forth. There's a lot of ambiguity as it relates to just, again, where it ebbs and flows. But what you do see, like you mentioned, is the optimism of the American administration or the American country coming in, of course, helping to change the course of the war and coming in and saying, look, if they could just get behind this. But in reality, what we've seen is, and we will see this, that the British finally just said, we're done. We're out of here. We can't solve it. So let's hand it over to the fledgling United Nations, and maybe they can solve it. And as we know, there was some realism there and some fairness and we'll get there, with November of 1947, but the two-state partition plan. But what we'll find here is this, that I think what Ibn Saud said, that there really is no way to have them live together. So even if you have the separate states, which the Arabs have always rejected, of course we know that Israel did, but they cannot live together. And even you mentioned this too, that I find it fascinating that we'll allow the Jews to live under an Arab state, one state, and we'll give them equal citizenship, and they'll be living, but in reality, the Jews know that. They lived under that with the Turkish Empire. And they realized that it wasn't fair. They had dhimmi status, they had secondary class status, and so they knew better. I guess we'll say it that way.
And the Holocaust put paid to any of that, because they lived under as citizens in the German state, and look what the German state did to them, So so you could see. I mean, the Zionists are pretty hardened now coming out of the war, because before that they had, even Weizmann had been, I think, with Faisal of Iraq, he'd been this talk of the Greater Syria, and they toyed with the idea. They got on well. They toyed with the idea of having a Jewish autonomous region state under a Greater Syria. A Greater Syria country, so they would be under Arab hegemony, but they would have their independence. And we can try and make that work. But of course, as the years progress, but the war puts an end to that completely. You can see why the Zionists come out and say, no, we want to stay. That's it. And they, like you said, they are actually willing to have a two-state solution at this stage. So we'll just briefly then go through our. So when you were saying that about the Arabs with that Canaanites, I say. So the Arabs are claiming they were Nephilim, then, are they?
Exactly.
Sorry to mix our streams here, But anyway, so Churchill is out in July 25th 1945, the Labour Party is in. Bevan is the new Foreign Secretary. Churchill is now leader of the opposition. And Bevan denies entry into Palestine of 100,000 Holocaust survivors. And of course, he rejects Churchill's assurances to the 37 Peel Commission. Now, the 37 Peel Commission is the very first time that the British considered a two-state solution. It was the first time it was actually proposed, was in 36, 37. How are we going to get these two people to live together? And Lord Peel said, you can't. Like exactly what you said, you can't. They're not going to live together. Let's split the land and create two states. Now, that was rejected by both Jews and Arabs. But, you know, the framework, the narrative had been created for a two-state solution. And it was rejected for different reasons. The Arabs just would not countenance any autonomous Jewish state outside of a greater Arab state, right? So yeah, like you say, we can protect their rights, but you know, we figured out how that's going to work out, right? And this at this time now, Ernest Bevan, he's kind of he said that the Jewish immigration will be limited, as the same with the White Paper, and that Britain now favours a homeland for the Jews, not a state for the Jews. Okay. So after the war, an Anglo-American committee of inquiry was set up, and here's what they found: the Arabs of Palestine are descendants of the indigenous inhabitants who have been in occupation of it since the beginning of history. Oh, sorry, this is what the Arab office submits to the document, to the American Committee inquiry. Again, repeating this history. Arabs of Palestine are descendants of the indigenous inhabitants who have been in the occupation of it since the beginning of history. The Jewish claim is based upon a historical connection which ceased effectively many centuries ago, and we still have that narrative, don't we, of Israel being a colonial settler state, an imposition of Western imperialism, yada 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 yada, right? You know, just endless. So that's kind of, again, so even this Anglo-American inquiry is you know, if they can find a way to progress the cause of both the Jews and the Arabs. There was a guy called Sir Stafford Cripps, and he says this in Parliament: the future of Palestine will not be decided by terrorism and by violence. So Churchill responds to this again. We're just going to read his. Churchill Cripps spoke of the past 25 years as being the most unkind or unhappy Palestine has known, right? The Mandate period. I imagine that it would hardly be possible to state the opposite of the truth more compendiously. I love Churchill's voice. Not that I can do it. The years during which we have accepted the mandate have been the brightest that Palestine has known and were full of hope. Of course, there was always friction because the Jew was in many cases allowed to go far beyond the strict limits of the interpretation which was placed upon the mandate. Meanwhile, how did we treat the Arabs? We have treated them very well. The House of Hussein reigns in Iraq. Faisal was placed on the throne. His grandson is there today. The Emir Abdullah, whom I remember appointing at Jerusalem in 1921 to be in charge of Transjordania, is there today. Syria and Lebanon owe their independence to the great exertions made by the British government. In fact, all sorts of hopes were raised among the Jews of Palestine, just as other hopes were raised elsewhere. However, when the months slipped by and no decided policy or declaration was made by the present government, now he's talking about the Labour government now, a deep and bitter resentment spread throughout the Palestine Jewish community. The disappointment and disillusionment of the Jews at the procrastination and indecision of the British Labour government are no excuse, because the Jews now are beginning to engage in acts of terrorism. They blow up the King David Hotel, the Irgun, the Lehi, what have you. Churchill is really against this. He castigates them. He calls them Jewish terrorists. And then he says here that they should be rooted out, punished with full severity of the law. And then, you know, he gets some pushback because, you know, people are thinking, well, he's Churchill is against Jews emigrating to Palestine. But here's what Churchill says in response to that. He says, I'm against preventing Jews from doing anything which other people are allowed to do. I am against that, and I have the strongest abhorrence of the idea of anti-Semitic lines of prejudice. We have never sought or got anything out of Palestine. We have discharged a thankless, painful, costly, laborious, inconvenient task for more than a quarter of a century with a very great measure of success. It is Great Britain and Great Britain alone which has steadfastly carried that cause forward across a whole generation to its present actual position, and the Jews all over the world ought not to be in a hurry to forget that. I had always intended to put it to our friends in America from the very beginning of the post-war discussions that either they should come in and help us in this Zionist problem about which they feel so strongly. So, that was his intention, of course, to play on this Anglo-American relationship. But of course, he's now out of office. He can't do that. So here's what he suggests. Here is the action. Action this day. I think the government should say that if the United States will not come and share the burden of the Zionist cause, as defined or as agreed, we should now give notice that we will return our mandate to the United Nations organizations and that we will evacuate Palestine within a specified period. At the same time, we should inform Egypt we stand by our treaty rights and will by all means maintain our position in the Canal Zone. These are the two positive proposals which I submit most respectfully to the House. Insofar as the government may have hampered themselves in any way from adopting these simple policies, they are culpable in the last degree, and the whole empire and the Commonwealth would be the sufferers from their mismanagement. So he's not a fan of the new government and their indecision. I mean, this is the guy who literally led the war, right? He was the leader of the free world. It would all have crumbled under Nazism if it really was not for his leadership. And now he's watching this successor government, kicking their heels about what to do in Palestine and allowing the situation sort of to continue. So he's actually saying, if the Americans don't want to come in and help us, kick it back to the United Nations. Now, interesting, getting to the Americans now, Mondo, President Truman, so he's separating the proposal for separate Arab and Jewish states. So he's angering the British because the British decided they don't want that. They rejected this already. Now, the British now are thinking about a unitary state, of an Arab unitary state with a Jewish minority rights, right? Protection within the Jews within that state. So there was this Morrison-Grady plan, which the first I heard about researching this, and that plan, this came out of the London conference in December of, where are we, 1946, 47 now, are we? And it was basically an Anglo-American trusteeship of Western Palestine with autonomous Arab and Jewish areas. So this was kind of, the land would be split between Arab areas, Jewish areas, and the Jerusalem would always be internationalized. The British had decided that in 36, 37. They knew that was going to be the sticking point. So let's internationalize it. The same is happening here. But Churchill and Truman both agreed to this Morrison-Grady plan. And under this plan, it would be under like British government control, but the regions would be autonomous. They could create their own laws, they could do their own thing, etc. But the Americans would be in sponsoring. It's an Anglo-American plan. Of course, that was rejected by the Arabs. They proposed an Arab state in West Palestine with minority protection and citizenship for the Jewish population. And the Jewish Agency rejects any plan that does not include an independent Jewish state. So here you just have completely two opposing views. Thing is, Truman goes back because the Jewish Agency in America reject this Morrison-O'Grady plan. So he reneges. He says, I can't do anything with this. So now he sets this Anglo-American partnership, literally fragments right here in terms of try to do something for the Zionists. And here's what Churchill says on the 12th of November to the House of Commons. It is impossible to avoid expressing deep regret at the many changes of tactics and methods and the needless disappointment created throughout the world Jewry by the failure to fulfill the hopes which the party opposite, the Labour Party, excited by their promises and convictions at the general election, and above all, at the lack of any policy worthy of the name. And he accuses them of allowing just hatred to flare up and run rife throughout Palestine for more than a year. I cannot in any way, Churchill says, recede from the advice which I venture to give, namely that if we cannot fulfill our promises to the Zionists, we should without delay place our mandate for Palestine at the feet of the United Nations and give due notice of our impending evacuation of that country. If this offer is accepted, get this, Mondo, you quoted the scripture, if this offer is accepted, a burden which has become too heavy and too invidious for us to bear alone, will it be lifted from our shoulders and placed in international safekeeping. And when I read that, I just wrote, and it's proved to be too heavy for everyone else as well.
You know, Graham, this is just where we realize that the truthfulness of Scripture, Zechariah 12, is true. It's going to be, by God's design, too heavy for any of them to take it. Even all the wisdom of the nations of the world, that's certainly not working there either. So again, once again, Scripture's true. Yeah, and that's, of course, you know, we're holding to Scripture. So you know, people like Churchill and Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt died, but you know, seem to have good intention. Well, he does have good intentions, but it's even an empire couldn't make it happen. You know. As we're going to close, we'll probably have to pick up the rest of this story because we will then get into the partition plan. But what I want us to see is that this is where it begins. It's well thought out. This is the only solution, you know, to make this happen. You go back to the Balfour Declaration and how it was penned. You know, the wording of it with yes, a Jewish homeland, and those who penned it always knew there was going to be a Jewish state, but without, you know. Without prejudice to the Arab, the rights of the Arabs, etc., etc. So the Arab delegates, this is February 47, denied any form of partition or the renewal of Jewish immigration. The Jewish agency, who was attendance at this conference, rejected any solution other than partition into two separate states. So we've mentioned that a couple of times. The Jews were for two states. And they were willing to give up Jerusalem to get the two states side by side living peacefully. And Churchill, we'll maybe pick up this next time, but Churchill was pretty enthused by the whole idea of what could be achieved if the Jews and Arabs just put their minds to each other, put their minds to the land, and played off each other's strengths. The Jews brought ingenuity, they brought a superior culture and civilization, skills, as Ibn Saud had said. But of course, the Arabs were, also industrious and they knew the land as well. So this is kind of, I think, where the story of the two-state solution begins. Well, it is where it begins. And it begins with a great deal of hope that, it already seems dead in the water, doesn't it? All the way back in 1945, because one side we say, yeah, we'll go for it. The other side says no, we're not going to. So I'll leave you with the final thoughts, because we want to wrap up here and pick up the second part of the story on the next one. Yeah, well, I think the one thing that struck out to me was just some of the language or the propaganda, in that when we look at the people of Israel, the Jewish people, if you want to say it that way, they were called colonizers, and they're going to go and they're going to spread, and they're going to use this as a buffer to expand their own hegemony in the rest of the Middle East. But in reality, that is not what they wanted. They wanted a place where they wouldn't be murdered, and they were able, even in that partition plan of the United Nations and others. They had a very small area, very, very small sliver of desert as it relates to what was divided by the United Nations. They accepted it, the Arabs rejected it. But what's interesting to me is that, if you look today at modern Israel, whether now their possession of the Golan Heights or even out down to the rest of the Negev to the south. How did that happen? Well, it happened through defensive wars. All of them. Israel never sought to expand itself by going out and either colonizing or annexing anything. They were attacked. This is just a matter of history. Every time they were attacked, they responded. And in order to prevent certain level, like we're seeing even today in Lebanon, they come in and they occupy a certain place beyond the boundaries of the Litani River because they're getting attacked. So I find it interesting that somebody can make the claim that, look, Israel has expanded their borders because they're expansionists. Well, that is not the way history showed itself. That they were content there, and any of those things, even gaining the Sinai Peninsula in the Six-Day War, they gave it back up. But again, they weren't out there attacking Egypt and trying to get the Sinai Peninsula or even the Golan Heights, unless, again, just remind everybody, it was in self-defense that their borders expanded. And that's typical of all war, right? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into the later. I think this is going to be a bit of a longer series because I think we really need to cover this, fully, the historical, how this has developed to where we are today. But it's interesting. I just wanted to. There's a quote from Churchill. I'll do it next time, but where he says, "No, the Jews have to be given the desert because the Arabs are a desert people, right? That's their natural homeland. But it's the Jews who have the ability to make the desert bloom."
Yes.
I mean, he's quoted scripture, and it's like, and of course, that's exactly what's happened, So again, the inability. But I think, when we get down to it, we get into the nitty gritty, the delegitimization of, is this a land issue? Is this a racial issue? Is this a religious issue? What issue is it? And of course, it's all of those things. But ultimately, it's a delegitimization issue.
Yeah.
But that'll be for a later episode. So, Mondo, I hope I haven't bored everybody with the reading. But I think it's just really important because these are the people who are making the decisions, who are shaping the decisions, and decisions which we are now still left with to deal with. So when people when people are saying our modern politicians are talking about a two-state solution, it's well ingrained. It's well because there actually is no other solution, but it's not a solution at all, right? So it's like I say, and I'll just end with this. The two-state solution is the only solution in town, but that town was razed to the ground a long time ago. So.
Yep, I think this has been great, Graham, in the sense, and I hope again our listeners are appreciating that the detail we have that we're getting into here of history is shaping not only what we see today, but also where it's going. Again, to me, I look at it through the prophetic lens, and as we look down the line and before the Lord's return, all that stuff is it's like a cycle, and the fact of the matter is, at least scripturally speaking, until the Antichrist, right? Until he comes on the scene, there is no ability for what we see as a permanent solution. And as we know that's not a permanent solution either because of his own egomania. But nevertheless, encourage people to stick around. This has been a good time, again, with our friend Graham here. And I hope you appreciate all that we're doing. It is important to get the facts and the history. And I my goal is to be unbiased. And as we know, even as you mentioned, Graham, Churchill called out these Jewish terrorists. So there were terrorists against a lot of what the British were doing there. So we'll call it as we see it. We're truth tellers here. But again, as we look forward, this is what we have. So thanks, Graham. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And catch us next time.